It was supposed to be a quiet getaway, a retreat from the constant noise and stress of city life. David and Lisa had been looking forward to the trip for months. A cabin deep in the woods, far from cell towers and highways, promised the perfect escape. The journey itself was long and winding, the forest thickening with every mile they drove. The trees, tall and ancient, seemed to crowd the road, casting long shadows even in daylight. When they finally arrived, the cabin looked like something out of a postcard, rustic, charming, with a view of the dense woods surrounding it. The front porch creaked under their weight as they stepped inside, and the musty smell of old wood greeted them. Everything was as they expected, simple, cozy, and far removed from the modern world. But as the evening wore on, an unsettling feeling began to creep into their minds. It started small, a rustling outside, the kind of sound you might ignore in a suburban backyard but couldn't shake off here, in the middle of nowhere. Lisa dismissed it as wildlife, but David couldn't shake the sense that something was watching them. The silence outside was too thick, too unnatural. By nightfall, the cabin felt less like a retreat and more like a trap. The wind howled through the trees, and the sounds outside became more distinct. Branches snapping, leaves crunching, and something else, whispers, barely audible but undeniably there. David peered out the window, his heart racing, but there was nothing to see. Just the darkness, thick and impenetrable, stretching on endlessly beyond the tree line. Lisa suggested they turn in for the night, but sleep didn't come easy. As the hours crept by, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. They were not alone in the woods, and whatever was out there was getting closer. The following morning, David and Lisa tried to shake off the unsettling feeling from the previous night. The sun was shining, and the forest around them looked harmless enough in the daylight. Birds chirped in the trees, and a cool breeze rustled the leaves. It almost felt ridiculous to admit how terrified they had been the night before. Over breakfast, they laughed about it, blaming the isolation and their overactive imaginations. But the uneasy atmosphere quickly returned. While Lisa was washing the dishes, she noticed something strange through the kitchen window: footprints. Large, muddy prints leading away from the cabin into the woods, as if someone had been standing outside watching them. She called David over, and together they inspected the tracks. They were far too big to belong to any animal. A chill ran down David's spine as he followed the trail with his eyes. It disappeared into the dense forest. Who the hell would be out here? David muttered, but neither of them had an answer. As the day wore on, strange occurrences piled up. Lisa swore she kept hearing her name whispered on the wind, and David felt as if he was being watched, though every time he looked, there was no one there. Their nerves were fraying, and the isolation that had once seemed like a dream now felt suffocating. By afternoon, they had resolved to cut the trip short. The peace they sought was nowhere to be found in these woods. But when David went outside to load their things into the car, the reality of their situation hit them hard. The car wouldn't start. It hadn't rained, there was no damage, and yet it refused to turn over. Panic gripped Lisa as she checked her phone. No signal. Nothing. They were stranded. As dusk fell, the feeling of being watched returned with full force. This time, however, it wasn't just a feeling. While David tried to troubleshoot the car, Lisa stood on the porch, eyes scanning the edge of the forest. The shadows between the trees seemed to shift and move. At first, she thought it was her imagination, but then she saw it, something tall and slender, half hidden among the trees, watching her. Its eyes glinted in the dying light. She screamed for David, and by the time he came running, the figure had vanished. There was someone out there, she insisted, her voice trembling. David grabbed a flashlight and, against her protests, ventured into the woods to investigate. His footsteps crunched through the underbrush as the beam of light flickered through the trees. He saw nothing but darkness and the endless forest. But as he turned back towards the cabin, his heart sank. The whispers had returned, louder now, as if they were right next to him. Lisa stood frozen on the porch, her face pale with fear. From the edge of the forest, dozens of glowing eyes blinked into existence, watching them from the shadows. The cabin felt like a fortress, but David and Lisa both knew it was anything but. With the car dead and the darkness pressing in from all sides, they had no choice but to huddle inside, hoping that the walls would somehow keep whatever was out there at bay. Lisa locked the doors and windows, her hands trembling as she glanced out at the forest, where the glowing eyes still hovered, watching their every move. David paced the living room, flashlight in hand, the beam flickering erratically. The whispers had grown louder, more distinct, but now they weren't just whispers, they were voices. Male and female, young and old, all speaking at once, their words unintelligible, a cacophony of terror that seemed to come from all around them. It was as if the forest itself had come alive. Suddenly, there was a loud bang on the roof. Lisa jumped, her heart pounding in her chest. "What was that?" she whispered, though she knew there was no point in asking. David grabbed a fireplace poker, the only thing remotely resembling a weapon, and motioned for her to stay behind him. The bang came again, followed by the sound of something heavy sliding across the roof. "Whatever it is, it's trying to get in," David muttered, his knuckles white around the poker. Just as he finished speaking, the sound shifted. This time, it was coming from the front door, a soft, deliberate knock. 3 taps, slow and steady. David's grip tightened on the poker as he and Lisa exchanged a terrified glance. The knocking continued, louder now, as if whoever, or whatever, was outside was growing impatient. "I'm not opening that door," Lisa said, her voice barely above a whisper. But David felt compelled to respond, as though the knock was demanding an answer. Against his better judgment, he moved toward the door, holding his breath as he peered through the peephole. Nothing. No one was there. But before he could even step back, the doorknob twisted on its own, and the door swung open with a creak. A cold wind rushed into the cabin, extinguishing the fire in the hearth and plunging the room into near darkness. Lisa screamed, backing away, but David stood frozen, staring out into the pitch-black night. The whispers flooded into the room, louder and clearer than ever. They filled the space with a chilling presence, voices overlapping, calling their names, taunting them with words they couldn't quite understand. David slammed the door shut, but it was too late. The cabin had been breached, and the spirits of the forest were inside. Without warning, the windows rattled violently, and the floorboards creaked under invisible footsteps. Something unseen moved through the cabin, brushing past them, cold and malicious. Lisa felt a sharp tug on her hair and screamed as the force yanked her off her feet. David lunged forward, trying to pull her back, but it was as if something was dragging her toward the door. "Let her go," he shouted, but the words barely left his mouth before the door flew open again, and Lisa was ripped from his grasp. She disappeared into the night, her screams echoing through the forest as the door slammed shut behind her. David was alone now, the whispers growing louder, mocking him. He bolted toward the door, yanking it open, but there was no sign of Lisa, only the endless blackness of the woods and the malevolent glow of the eyes watching him from the trees. David stood on the porch, the darkness of the woods swallowing him whole. The whispers that had once been distant now echoed in his ears, louder and clearer with each passing second. His mind raced, thoughts jumbled and panicked, as he searched for any sign of Lisa. But the woods were silent now, as if the forest itself had swallowed her whole. "Lisa," he shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. Only the wind answered, cold and biting. The glowing eyes had vanished, retreating into the thick shadows between the trees. He was alone, utterly alone, in a place where the line between reality and nightmare blurred. The minutes dragged on like hours. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig sent David's heart racing, but he forced himself to move forward. He couldn't stay in the cabin. Not after what happened. He grabbed the flashlight from the porch, its beam weak but enough to light a few feet ahead of him, and ventured into the woods. The trees seemed to close in around him, their branches twisting and reaching like skeletal hands. The trail that had led them to the cabin was gone, replaced by a maze of unfamiliar paths. His footsteps were frantic, unsteady, and each step seemed to take him deeper into the heart of the forest, a place where the laws of nature no longer applied. David's mind began to unravel. He could feel it, the slow creep of madness overtaking him. His thoughts spiraled as he recalled the strange occurrences of the past few days. The whispers. The figure in the trees. The eyes. Lisa's disappearance. He began to wonder if any of it was real. Had the isolation gotten to them? Or was the forest playing tricks on them, warping their perceptions, feeding off their fear? Suddenly, a voice cut through the darkness, Lisa's voice. Faint, but unmistakable. "David, help me." He spun around, shining the flashlight in every direction, but there was no one. The voice came again, more desperate this time. "David, please." His heart pounded in his chest as he raced toward the sound, his legs moving faster than his mind could process. But the more he ran, the further away the voice seemed to get. It was as if the forest itself was toying with him, pulling him deeper into its embrace, feeding him false hope only to watch him crumble. He stopped, gasping for breath, and listened. The voice had vanished. All that remained was the whispering wind and the oppressive darkness pressing down on him. But something else had changed. The forest no longer felt empty. He could feel it, eyes watching him from the shadows, the same eyes that had stared at them from the cabin. And then he saw it. Ahead, barely visible in the dim light, stood a figure. Tall and twisted, its form blending with the trees as though it were part of the forest itself. Its face was obscured by shadows, but its eyes gleamed with an unnatural light. David froze, every instinct in his body screaming at him to run, but he couldn't move. The figure was moving toward him, slow and deliberate, its movements almost fluid as it weaved through the trees. "David." The voice whispered again, but it wasn't Lisa this time. It was something else. Something older. Something malevolent. The figure stepped closer, and David finally broke. He turned and ran, his mind a blur of terror as he sprinted through the forest. The branches clawed at him, tearing at his clothes and skin, but he didn't stop. The whispers followed him, growing louder, more frenzied. His flashlight flickered, and for a brief moment, everything went black. When the light came back on, he was standing in front of the cabin again. But something was wrong. The cabin wasn't the same. The walls were warped, twisted as though the structure had aged 100 years in a matter of hours. The windows were dark, and the door hung crooked on its hinges. The whispers surrounded him, filling the air with their taunting voices, and in the middle of the porch, sitting motionless, was Lisa. David's heart lurched. She sat with her back to him, her head bowed, her hair covering her face. "Lisa," he whispered, stepping forward cautiously. No response. The closer he got, the more his stomach twisted. Something was wrong. Her posture was too still, too unnatural. He reached out a trembling hand to touch her shoulder, but the moment his fingers grazed her skin, she crumbled into dust. David stumbled back, his mind snapping. The whispers grew louder, deafening now, as the forest seemed to close in on him from all sides. The cabin, the trees, the very ground beneath his feet pulsed with malevolent energy. There was no escape. He was trapped in the heart of something ancient and evil, something that had been waiting for them all along. David's mind shattered as Lisa's remains blew away into the darkened air. The cabin, once a symbol of retreat and solace, now stood as a decaying monument to his inevitable doom. The whispers that had haunted him since the first night were no longer just sounds in the air, they were inside his head, crawling under his skin, sinking deep into his thoughts. "Join us, join us," they chanted, a maddening chorus that twisted reality into a distorted nightmare. His flashlight flickered and died completely, leaving him in pitch-black darkness. But even without light, David felt the presence of the figures. They surrounded him, pressing in closer and closer. He could feel their icy breath on the back of his neck, the prickling sensation of their cold fingers brushing against his skin. The air grew thick, suffocating. David staggered backwards, his legs weak and trembling. He wanted to scream, to cry out for help, but his voice was gone. All he could do was listen to the endless whispering, endless voices that promised he would never leave these woods. Suddenly, the ground beneath him gave way, and he fell. The sensation was immediate. He was tumbling into the earth, the forest swallowing him whole. He hit the bottom hard, landing in what felt like a damp, cold pit. Dirt and roots clawed at his skin, but the fall wasn't what terrified him. It was the sound of the breathing. He slowly raised his head, and his eyes adjusted to the faint, eerie glow around him. He was underground, deep beneath the forest floor, in some kind of ancient cavern. And there, in the center, was a massive, pulsating tree, its roots gnarled and twisted, stretching up through the earth like veins. The tree exhaled, a deep and rhythmic breath, as though it were alive. And in its branches, hanging like grotesque ornaments, were bodies, men and women, their faces frozen in terror, their eyes wide open. They were the lost souls of the forest. David's breath caught in his throat as the realization hit him. These were the others. The ones who had come before him. The ones who had tried to escape but had been consumed by the forest. Their bodies swayed gently in the breeze, their mouths moving in unison with the whispers. "Join us," they chanted, their voices blending with the wind. David tried to stand, but his legs wouldn't obey him. The roots from the tree had snaked around his ankles, pulling him toward the trunk. He clawed at the dirt, screaming in terror, but the more he struggled, the tighter the roots held him. The tree wanted him, wanted to consume him just as it had consumed all the others. The whispers filled his ears, growing louder, until they were deafening. His mind felt like it was splitting apart, every ounce of his sanity being torn away. He could feel the tree pulling at his soul, tugging him toward oblivion. And then, just as he thought it was over, he heard a familiar voice. David. It was Lisa. Her voice, clear and strong, cutting through the noise. He looked up, and there she was, standing just beyond the tree, her body whole, her eyes pleading. She reached out a hand to him, beckoning him to come. "Lisa," he whispered, tears streaming down his face. "Come with me," she said, her voice gentle but urgent. "It's the only way." He reached for her, desperate, but as their fingers touched, something in him snapped. Lisa's face twisted into a cruel smile, her eyes turning black. She wasn't Lisa. She had never been. She was just another part of the forest, another illusion designed to trap him. David screamed, but there was no escape. The tree's roots pulled him in, and the last thing he saw before darkness consumed him was the endless sea of eyes watching from the forest above. The cabin, the woods, the spirits, they had claimed him, just as they had claimed all the others. And now, David would be a part of the forest forever, another soul trapped in the roots of the ancient tree.